Okay.
But it's with great pleasure that I introduce kind of both Sue and Sarah. I'll leave it for yourselves to do kind of full introductions, and when you want me to start sharing the slides, let me know and I will do so.
Okay. You start sharing them straight away, Tim. That's fine. If I could introduce myself, I'm Sue Gower. I'm the ACES Programme Manager working with Public Health. And Sarah?
I'm Sara Rothwell. I'm with the Kent Medway Violence Reduction Unit. I'm the coordinator for Thanet and Canterbury.
So we're going to talk today about ACEs, adverse childhood experiences, and trauma-informed practice. So if we could start on slide 3, Tim. So why do these matter? You've probably heard them, that the term's been bandied around for a while. But on the next slide, you'll see the definition of an adverse childhood experience. So the key point is its adversity in childhood. ACEs have become a terminology. People like acronyms, and ACEs is one of them. But it's actually a number of negative, stressful experiences that any child might experience growing up. And sadly, as you will see from the examples given, they're all too common. So a study by Andrew and Folletti found that 60% of people had experienced at least one adverse childhood experience, and 20% had experienced more when they were growing up. So this is actually quite common. Next. Some more examples of childhood households. So you won't be unfamiliar with these. It's the stuff of your practice every day. But the important issue is the childhood household, which includes the issues of the adults. And the study was reflective. What it found was that in adulthood, when they were dealing with adults who were experienced domestic abuse, whether it was divorce, mental illness, substance misuse, when they tracked back, there was a correlation to the adversity in childhood they'd studied that had never been dealt with, really. It'd just been moved on from. Next. So the key issue is that the relevance of the adversity is that the more adversity suffered, the more likely it will impact on mental and physical health going forward. And the study actually suggests that if children were experiencing more than 4 adverse childhood experiences, then their behaviour was likely to be impacted. So risk-taking behaviours, poorer outcomes in school, in social relationships, and in health. Next. And you'll see from this slide the range of problems. So you've got the mental health problems, you've got risky behaviours, you've got chronic health problems, all of which sit in the public health domain. But the important thing to note about this is that future outcomes are not prescribed by past experience. They don't have to be this way. So whilst adversity may be suffered, the amount of resilience an individual has, the amount of protective factors an individual has, and the way in which they're supported by practitioners involved with them will make a huge difference. Next. So we're just going to show you this short clip, which in a nutshell sort of describes what this is all about.
My parents don't understand. All the drinking and fighting means I'm scared. I'd like a cuddle, perhaps a bedtime story, but mostly I'd like them to stop shouting at me. And sometimes they hit me. Feeling scared every day and not feeling loved or wanted will change me for the rest of my life. Later, I'll have problems at school, problems with alcohol, and I'll get in trouble with the police. What's happening to me right now means I'm more likely to have serious health problems in middle age and die sooner than I should. Doctors say my life is full of adverse childhood experiences, or ACEs. But in my world, this means I see my dad hitting my mum. Dad's got a drinking problem, and mum's always crying, even with the tablet. I am always being shouted at and hit. After the booze and fags, there's not a lot of money for toys or clothes, or even food. I'm getting used to being scared all the time. Now I'm just angry. Doctors say things are changing inside me. My brain isn't learning how to control my feelings properly. My body can't relax like those kids who don't have ACEs, so my body won't be able to repair itself properly when I get older, making it more likely I'll get cancer or heart disease as an adult. It hurts when my parents hit me, but the real damage is hidden, and that damage will be with me for life.
I drink and smoke. They say I'm out of control, but I'm not. It's just my way of coping with my ACEs. I've been in plenty of fights, but what's wrong with that? Kids' punches don't hurt half as much as when my dad hits me. I beat up a kid last week at school because he looked at me weird. Who cares? I ended up with more time out of school. Learning's not for me anyway, and the teachers don't care any more than my parents. I don't like the way anyone looks at me except my girl. She's 16 and pregnant, just like my mum was with me.
So this is where I've ended up. I've got diabetes and cancer's probably on the way. I know these kill you, but I couldn't do without them. I've never had a proper job and I've spent time inside. I hate my kids. I hate their mum too, until she left, so my kids have grown up with ACEs. And now my daughter had her first kid. She's 16. The course of my life was set in the wrong direction a long time ago. I know where I'm heading, and sadly I know where my kids are heading too. This doesn't have to happen. A little help in childhood makes a big difference to where life takes you. When I was a baby, the nurses noticed that my mum wasn't coping and helped her and explained how important my childhood is to the rest of my life. So, with a bit of help, she coped. The police came round after next door complained about the noise from Mum and Dad fighting. They asked how I was feeling. I told them I was scared all the time. Mum and Dad got help. The shouting got better and the hitting stopped. I even got some bedtime stories. I still had problems at school, but the teacher asked me about what was happening at home. I got help controlling my feelings. It wasn't a lot, but it was enough. I'm now married with 2 children, and I've got a job, most of the time. I haven't repeated the same problems with my kids. We got help when being a parent got too much. Our children are ACE-free, and that means their kids stand a good chance of growing up ACE-free as well. Almost half the people in England and Wales experienced one ACE as a child, and 1 in 10 of us suffered 4 or more ACEs. If we stop ACEs, millions of children would not become smokers or binge drinkers, and levels of violence in adults would be cut in half. Fewer ACEs in childhood also means fewer adults developing diseases like cancer, heart disease, and diabetes in middle age. We all need to be ACE aware. Are you? Doctors, police, nurses, teachers, firefighters, and most importantly, parents. The more you know about ACEs, the more you can help stop children growing up with ACEs in their lives. And for those of you who have already suffered ACEs, the more you know, the more you can help yourself and others who have suffered ACEs cope.
Thanks, Tim. So that little clip is a couple of years old now, and you can see the emphasis on the adversity in childhood. We've moved forward now, and whilst we recognise the importance of ACEs, what is essential is the recognition of dealing with them appropriately by way of trauma-informed practice. So next. So you saw in the video the clip, the relevance of this agenda. It's cross-cutting. It's as important for adults who've experienced adversity in childhood as it is to the children who are experiencing it today. So the agenda that I'm managing at the moment is across adults and children's services to promote this approach and to highlight the importance of trauma-informed principles. Because it's the trauma that's suffered and dealt with and often hidden by the adversity in childhood that comes out in later life if it's not addressed. And I think perhaps a good example of this is the victims of sexual abuse at the hands of Jimmy Savile. For years and years, the trauma they suffered by not being able to tell anybody was hidden until it came to light. And then, as you know, hundreds of them came out and were given help and actually were able to deal with what they'd gone through, not being believed. So the approach with trauma-informed practice is really moving from what's wrong with you to what happened to you, a more understanding and empathetic approach. Next. So just a couple of slides on trauma. The definition of trauma: events or circumstances that are experienced as harmful or life-threatening, but more importantly have lasting impacts on mental, physical, emotional, social well-being. And that came from the SAMHSA study from which the ACEs agenda originated in 2014. And as you can see, it is any event that overwhelms a person's capacity for positive coping. We all know about PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder, and actually there's a scale of this, and a lot of people are on the lower end, but still dealing with this every day, and they're in survival mode. Next. So the last slide from me, just to reinforce trauma, it's an injury. It's an injury that impacts the way your brain functions. It actually puts you in stress mode all the time, unregulated stress, and that impacts on the way we function. And I think most of us have been in a stressful situation where actually you can't focus on anything because it's just overwhelming. And whilst it's part of normal life, when it becomes overloaded, it puts the brain into survival mode and not in functioning mode. And that really is at the heart of trauma-informed practice. So I'm now going to hand over to Sara, who's going to take you forward into that arena.
So from this slide, you can see that there is actually a link between ACE and trauma. We have two images there of a healthy brain and an abused brain. So what we're stating is that actually adverse childhood experience to be in that stressful, toxic situation can actually cause an injury to the brain. So if you look at the healthy brain, there's lots of red, there's lots of green, there's lots of neurons firing, where if you look at the abused brain, there's not nearly so much colour, and therefore it's recognised that this is a brain injury. And thinking about adolescence, which is really my bag, adolescents always they always have risky behaviours. That's part of being an adolescent. But there's a difference between an adolescent who's experienced trauma. So we know that in an adult, the front part of the brain, the prefrontal cortex, is more developed. It allows for us to think with that front part of our brain, meaning that we can make rational, controlled decisions. Young people can't do that, and if they have trauma, then that's even harder for them. They think very much with their limbic system. They're always in the fight, flight, or freeze mode. They don't have the ability to weigh up their options, and they act first and think afterwards. So Sue mentioned about PTSD, and we know that in children and adolescents that can present actually very similarly to other conditions, for example, ADHD. We see lots of diagnosis of ADHD, but we see very, very limited diagnosis of young people with PTSD. And that's something that maybe we need to consider, that these young people are experiencing complex PTSD symptoms. So thinking about complex trauma and developmental trauma, we look at the medical model to a degree, and that was apparent from the video. It talked about cancer and diabetes, but we also need to think about the interpersonal, the social models, and as well. We know that when we're experiencing complex trauma, it's constant exposure, it's multiple events. So thinking about a child who's in a DA experience or has even experiencing other forms of abuse, where the child doesn't have any ability to control the situation or has any power of change, it means that they have no control and they're probably not being regulated by an adult. In, say, developmental trauma, we might be thinking about a single incident or an event that has a clear beginning and a clear end. And once the event is over, the survivor can reach a place of safety and seek help to recover, or actually have the ability to do that themselves. Whereas at complex trauma, it's ongoing and repeated with very little time to recover. Next, please, Tim. So normally this would be an input, but I'm quite mindful of time. But perhaps you can all have a think about the things that you do to alleviate stress. When we've asked these questions before, people have given lots of examples. So some people drink, some people smoke, some people run, some people watch television or read. There's lots of things that we can use to alleviate stress, and that's really important from our social networks and hobbies that we have. So have a think about that while we proceed. Next, please. So thinking about the stress that we experience, there are 3 levels that we talk about. We have the healthy stress. So this is the stress we experience, the general life decisions, getting the kids ready for school in the morning, those kinds of things, rushing around, all of those, packed lunch, getting in the car, getting everybody in socks and shoes. We can usually self-regulate from this. Then there's tolerable stress. So this might be being in a constant busy work environment, and we can usually, again, self-regulate, or we can get co-regulation from colleagues, family, and friends. And then that leads us on to the toxic stress, which is overwhelming experiences. So this is where the trauma comes from. It's repeated, it's uncontrollable, the individual's unable to self-regulate, and very rarely has somebody to help them co-regulate. Next, please. So what causes stress to become toxic? This is just that repeated continuation. So is around severity and also the time span that people experience it. The other thing that can impact on that is our ability to be resilient. So those that don't have natural resilience or don't have co-regulation or assistance in regulating. So we know that some people have developed a higher level of resilience and regulation. They have better social networks, and that allows them to manage and cope better. They manage the stress more effectively, and it means that there's less likely for that stress to become toxic. Yet as humans, we all have times when stress becomes to that level where we feel more vulnerable and overloaded. But imagine that if you don't have the ability to self-regulate, or you don't have anybody to co-regulate for you. And in a child who doesn't have a parent, a carer, or trusted adult to regulate for them, it's really, really crucial that they do that, because this is where it leads to the brain injury. Next, please. So how does toxic stress and trauma impact on our children? So as humans, we're not born knowing how to regulate stress. Most children experience overwhelming stress at some point, even when we don't put that stress on them. Let's think about the terrible twos and the sort of overwhelming tantrums that children have at that age. Most situations, an adult or a parent will be able to support that child to co-regulate. But imagine if that didn't happen. Imagine how the stress might build up for that child. Imagine parents who don't have that skill for themselves. They haven't been taught or shown that skill. Consider their emotional availability. They're not available for that child. And one of the things that we do know is regulation comes from our social networks and our support. Next, please. So the impact of trauma. So this is what we experience from being in a situation where we are exposed to toxic stress. So in order to move away from toxic stress, to repair our brains, to move forward, we need to become able to self-regulate. A child exposed to trauma with no co-regulation, when they become a teen, they often get worse in terms of their risky behaviours. We know that the state of a teenager is to have and lead in themselves into situations where there's risk. Their adolescent brain hasn't developed, and the prefrontal cortex isn't helping them to make decisions. So when they experience trauma matched with the adolescent brain, everything is heightened. They cannot regulate, they cannot maintain social function, they cannot maintain positive relationships. They seek out those that are like them. And we know that therefore those peer relationships are vital for adolescents. So if those peer relationships are negative, then those young people are in a vicious cycle. So without the support and regulation from trusted adults, and we might recognise that at this stage that might be professionals rather than parents and carers, the cycle continues, and that's where we as professionals need to step in and support those young people. So one, they can come out of their adolescent brain period, and we know that the brain is still developing approximately up to the age of 25. So there's a long time there where we need to function with those young people and allow them that support of co-regulation. Next slide, please. So thinking about stress, trauma, ACEs in adolescence. So for a young person, this is the fight, flight or freeze survival mechanism that they experience. If you think about it, it's the flip the lid scenario, so where they actually just lose the plot completely and flip the lid. Another example is thinking about a bottle of fizzy pop. You shake it, you shake it, you shake it. Something happens, it calms down a little bit, then it gets shaken again, and eventually somebody releases the lid and it explodes everywhere. So that's thinking about a young person in that experience where they're dealing with trauma and adolescent brain. This leads some of our young people to consider that they might self-medicate, and then that leads to substance use, either alcohol or cannabis or other drugs. That gives them that opportunity to seek some kind of inner peace. We know that at this stage, these high levels of cortisol and adrenaline released, which increases the risky behaviours. And there is a slight risk that young people become addicted to the release of those chemicals within their brain. And just thinking about an example, thinking about a young woman in custody, she's been in a situation that has caused her to come into custody, but she might be pregnant. So she's in a situation where she's highly stressed already, and then custody adds a further stress to her. She's carrying a baby, she's released cortisol and adrenaline, but those chemicals are released to the baby in the womb, absorbed by the fetus. So therefore, we're already creating a trauma to that unborn by the level of the chemicals that they're receiving from the mother. Teenagers don't have consequential thinking. They lack it, and it's something that's very hard to teach. It's something that they have to learn for themselves. Next slide, please. So thinking about adolescence again, and we've talked about the fight, flight or freeze. Often they cannot process feelings and emotions. They can have a reduced ability to understand. They might not understand the language that gets used around them. They can present as rude, obnoxious. They can be shut down. They can be closed. They can be labelled as things like offender, self-harmer, as suicide ideation. And those are all matching into their stress, their hyperarousal, the panic, the rage, the impaired memory. Thinking about their impulse control, which we already know is reduced. They have a lack of consequential thinking. They're unable to take ownership for an event. They struggle with rewards and sanctions. These have little or no impact for them. And although we think the carrot is often better than the stick, the young people still need constant support to accept that carrot. Thinking about the shame levels, they're unable to cope with praise. They get aggressive from criticism. They have no understanding how to accept either criticism or praise. Next, please. So we say that they have a reduced ability to make sense of the world, and that's where we come in as professionals, but where we also come in as parents and carers. Our young people need support from a trusted adult who can help them to co-regulate. We need to reframe their experiences and break down some of the situations to aid their understanding. And these young people can benefit from positive, safe, social situations, but they're always going to need support to take that next step. And where parents or carers are unable to do this, then that's where we can step in as professionals to support them. Next, please. So trauma in the adolescent brain. So development is characterized by an imbalance between the limbic and the reward systems, and those mature earlier. So we know that that young person is already going to be working in that fight, fright or freeze, that monkey brain, the hind brain, the reactive behaviors, the risky behaviors. It's the prefrontal control system that develops, that helps them to bring rational thought and decision making into it. But we know that that develops later. We know that sometimes when they've experienced severe trauma, it doesn't develop at all. So in terms of development, they can be impacted by poor attachment. So those situations where they've had sort of that unresponsive adult in their lives, they might have ended up in the care system, they might have ended up with other family members. We know that positive attachment experiences develop more efficient neural pathways, and those might not be available in the home environment, but they can be gained in other examples of life, so schools, positive relationships with people outside of the home. What we're talking about is building those efficient neural pathways. We're balancing the risky behaviours with the decision making. We're supporting the young people to move from the lack of thought, the lack of common sense, the lack of thinking through things through properly, and the lack of consequences. So we're helping them to encourage and helping and encourage them to make better choices. These are reduced further potentially by poor peer relationships. They seek like-minded other young people. Pressure comes from peer relationships, risky activities, drinking and substance uses. If we think about some of the things that our teens do, would they do them on their own? They're more likely to do them in a group. If we think about the young people who do sort of the kind of climbing on scaffolding, would they do it on as a solo act, or is it a group activity? Would you take a smoke from a bit of weed if you're not doing it with friends? But if you deny doing it and somebody else is doing it, it seems more able for you to take part as well. The same with the underage drinking. So what young people are doing is they're acting first and then the thought comes after. Next, please.
One major source of illness, and I'm talking about any kind of illness, whether that's so-called mental illness or physical illness, and that's childhood trauma. And this is true whether I'm talking about anxiety, depression, ADHD, addiction, psychosis, bipolar illness, or if I'm talking about multiple sclerosis, cancer, rheumatoid arthritis, fibromyalgia, chronic fatigue, colitis, Crohn's disease, ALS, scleroderma, and as I said, malignancy as well. Now that seems like a very bold statement, view that just about everything, not everything, but just about everything that we call illness is rooted in compensations and adaptations that have to do with childhood trauma. This is from the journal Pediatrics, which is the official journal of the American Academy of Pediatrics, and the article appeared in their journal 6 years ago now, in February of 2012. And the article is from the Harvard Center on the Developing Child, and here's what they say in their abstract. Growing scientific evidence demonstrates that social and physical environments that threaten human development because of scarcity, stress, or instability can lead to short-term physiologic and psychological adjustments that are necessary for immediate survival and adaptation, but which may come at a significant cost to long-term outcomes in learning, behavior, health, and longevity. In other words, what they're saying is that the adaptations that children are forced to resort to in response to early stress help them endure that early duress and difficulty, but those same adaptations become a source of pathology later on and even threaten longevity. This article I quoted to you from Harvard wasn't published in some fly-by-night alternative publication. It was in a major medical journal. It's like makes no difference whatsoever. And that's why the research is just not incorporated into medical practice, despite the fact that it's been published and it's not even controversial.
Can we stop that there, please, Tim?
Well, now let's look at.
Thank you. Next slide, please.
That might be the tricky bit.
If you click just to the right of the picture, that's the video.
Yeah. Is that it?
That's it. Thank you. So we're talking about the repeated cycle of abuse here, and it's quite a telling picture. And if you see that it is a circular movement, repeated cycle. So the abused, potentially without support or intervention and without the right pathways and guidance, can become an abuser. And we do see that sadly all too often. Next, please. Okay, talking about the cycle of violence. So just some statistics here. We've already talked about, the balance with no ACEs versus 4 ACEs. So those with 4 ACEs, 14 times more likely to be the victim of violence, 15 times more likely to have committed a violent offence, and 20 times more likely to have been in custody. And that is obviously something that impacts on our adolescence through to adulthood. We also need to recognise that those young people flick between being a victim and a perpetrator. Thank you. Okay, what should we be doing as supportive and responsible adults, those adults that are supporting our young people to co-regulate? So what we want to do is we want to reduce the impact of ACEs with PACEs. So that's our protective and compensatory experiences. So unconditional positive regard, allowing an adolescent to connect with us and in other social situations with support. Community engagements. We always talk about encouraging young people to join clubs and activities, but actually it's really important for them to allow them to have positive social engagement and the development of social skills, as they can go some way to mitigating those impacts of trauma on their brains and helping them to make more rational decisions. To have in place routines, boundaries that are positive, but also challenges and consequences. Very important for the young person to manage the risk versus the consequential thinking. And we also need to support them to allow them to develop their own confidence in their abilities. We need to allow them to make mistakes, but we need to be there to help them pick up the pieces. And as professionals, we need to recognise that that might be our role because parents or carers are unable. Next, please. So there we are, just thinking a little bit more about PACEs and some of the things that can help them. So having a close friend, helping others in community projects, engaging in hobbies, having access to appropriate education, having access to a trusted adult who isn't a parent. Next, please. Okay, this is thinking about the language that we use when we talk about young people and even adults to agree. And Sue touched on this earlier. And we want to move away from the method of what we say in terms of what's wrong with you to what's happened to you. So what we're doing is by asking what happened to you, we're actually highlighting the threat. So for the young person, they might say, well, I was scared and humiliated. And actually, what might have happened is somebody laughed at them. And their survival mechanism might be to hit that person. So by reframing that to what happened to you, it allows us to help understand, to allow the young person to understand their experience and hopefully puts them onto the path of healing. And with insight, the young person might seek to take a different path going forward. Next, please. So this is some of the language that is used. We've all heard it used and how we can think about making it more positive. So one of the things that highlights for me is refuses to sit still. This is really vital for me. I've been in situations with young people where a parent says, oh, I'm sorry, he fidgets all the time, he never sits still. Actually, for me, it's not refusing to sit still. It's that young person might be hypervigilant, they're overstimulated, they need contact, they're actually unable to do that. And it's how we support them to do that. If you're sitting chatting to that young person about things, does it really matter if their knees and legs are bouncing and they're fidgeting? As long as you can continue with the conversation, it's fine. So thinking about reframing our language, and these are some examples of what you could use. Acting like a child. They are a child. They won't do something. Maybe they can't do it. Lazy. Does not try. Maybe they're exhausted with trying. Just some examples there for you. Thank you. Okay, when we're looking at behaviour management, again, around that, what is wrong with you? If we can be compassionate, we can have curiosity, we can help the young person by talking through an event or a situation, we can help them to process through it, and perhaps they can define a different outcome for the next time. Thank you. And this is for us as professionals. Every interaction is an intervention, and it's very telling that we use the iceberg model. We see a behaviour, but underneath that is all the other things that we need to consider. So we need to support them around positive behaviours. We need to use positive language. We can support them to make connections, and we can support them to increase their ability to regulate. When we're sharing information with our young people, we need to check their understanding of what we've just said. Have care when we're giving multiple instructions. I'm thinking about my own child, you know, I might give instructions. Can you put your plate in the dishwasher and then put out the rubbish, and can you let the dog in? But when I reflect on that, my child might have only heard, can you let the dog in? And actually, we need to consider that going forward. Has the young person got memory issues? Actually, adolescent brains are firing on so many neurons, it does impact on their memory. So actually, can they really remember what went on? So think about that next time that you're talking to a young person. Reframe your language, ask them if they understand, reframe it again, make sure there's understanding there, and don't assume that they will automatically remember. Thank you. Next slide. This is a video about other agencies considering their approach to adolescence.
One of the things that is key throughout various types of jobs that I go to is because we see people in their time of need, we often see people at their worst. What typically is most of our interactions with the general public is seeing them at their most angry, at their most frightened, at their most upset. I went with her in the car to custody, and once we got there, she was holding my hand and was very much unsure, was very much confused, and was looking for some sort of support because she realised that she couldn't change the circumstances. And she just kept asking, as any young person would, for her mum. She kept asking, please just let me go home, I've made a mistake, and really wanted just some sort of assurance while she was there of what was happening. And just seeing that vulnerability in her, I almost couldn't be angry for what she'd been like on her arrest because it wasn't personal. But one of the great things about this new sort of trauma-aware policing is that we can actually try and establish those relationships with people to break that down and say, look, yes, okay, you know, I may be sat here in a uniform, and yes, okay, you know, I do go out and I arrest people, but the main role that I do is actually looking after people and is safeguarding, and the age training definitely helped with that, and helped be able to sort of break some of those barriers down between communicating with police and the public, but also between the other agencies that we work with, because prior to this training, there was no communication at all. Now there's constant feedback, and safeguarding a person isn't just, I'll fill out a form for them, it's, I'll speak to them, I'll find out what they need, I'll get them that help, and then I'll follow up afterwards. So it's completely different, really. If you end up visiting maybe a shoplifter or a drug user, and then they start to tell you about these things that happened in earlier life, we're now aware of, okay, I don't just have to sort of sit here and listen and not do anything. I've now actually got the power to find that support in place to try and undo some of that damage.
Thank you. Okay, recovery and resilience for young people, but also for us as practitioners and professionals. So thinking about the toxic stress, most people are able to self-regulate and the brain connects with the recovery and there's no injury, and that is what we call resilience. Most people, most of the time, can recover from their traumas because they've had compensatory experiences, they've had co-regulation. We need to think about our traumatized children, so we need to stabilize them, integrate them, and support them to adapt. We need to help them to co-regulate. We need to reframe their language. We need to support them. Next, please. Working with our service users, and this is really thinking about us as professionals, thinking about you, what it's like on the front line on those difficult days. We all have clients who can be triggering in their behaviour. Days when people push our buttons. And we absorb the stress of our work colleagues and other bits and pieces. So if we've had a difficult morning with our own families, we've got caught in a traffic jam, we haven't been able to get fuel because of the current fuel crisis. Everything that we're experiencing will impact on how we manage our clients during the day. So therefore, as professionals, we need to make sure that we look after ourselves, and that's vital. Thank you. I'll hand you back over to Sue.
Thank you. So you've heard what the fundamental of this agenda is, and Kent and Medway are committed to becoming ACE aware and trauma informed. Original ambition was to do this by 2023. It's probably going to take longer now because obviously COVID interrupted a lot of the work that was going on. But you can see the key elements in this slide. It's routinely inquiring about adversity in childhood when we're working with families. It's listening, understanding, it's working in co-production, and appreciating what you're being told at its highest level. Learning from what's taken place elsewhere. We know that local authorities like Islington, some trauma-informed work with schools, and they've seen the exclusion rates drop because there's more understanding of what the children are going through, rather than just dealing with the behaviours by exclusion. And equally, we're looking for trauma-informed principles in the delivery and commissioning of services, because we know this is on the radar of inspection. So CQC and Ofsted are actively looking for evidence of this approach going forward. The workforce are key to this. Next slide, please. And it's multi-agency. This is across the board. Adults and children. Next. It does represent a huge amount of organisational change. Creating a trauma-informed organisation isn't just about looking at the practice, although that is a key part of it. It's looking beyond that into how we actually support our staff. I used to work in the managing the child death overview process, and I was conscious that my business support member of staff was looking at all the details of child death every day. And she said to me that before I came into post, nobody had actually asked her how she dealt with it. So we have admin staff who are considered for clinical supervision, but actually some of the information they're seeing is quite powerful and will have an effect on them. Next slide, please. So a trauma-informed approach is really where we're going forward. You can see it's a model. It's been researched as recently as 2018. It's recognising the signs of trauma in clients, families, staff. And let's face it, we've come out of COVID. Do you really know what people have been through? Do you really know what they've experienced? Now it's very unusual not to know somebody who knows somebody who's died of COVID, or maybe has long COVID, somebody who's lost their job perhaps. So there's a need to integrate knowledge about trauma into policies, procedure, practice at the highest level. And we'll be going and meeting with our cabinet member to talk about this process, and also the chief execs of all the district councils, to try and embed this approach at the very top. Next, please. There is a new film coming up called The Wisdom of Trauma. A lot of people saw the Resilience film last year that was widely put on in Kent. This really is the update. So this is just an introduction.
In the US, the richest society in history, fully half of the citizens have a chronic disorder such as high blood pressure or diabetes. Anxiety amongst young people is growing rapidly. Asthma and autoimmune diseases are on the rise, as are addictions. Depression is rising. Youth suicide is rising. All is not well.
I started heroin at 26. That's what really destroyed me. It just takes the pain away.
It's easy to want to escape reality completely instead of coping with it.
And so the question is, can we be human beings in the midst of civilization? Because what we call civilization demands the denial of human needs.
Please welcome Dr.
Every human being has a true, genuine, authentic self. And the trauma is that disconnection from it, and the healing is the reconnection with it. Why do we get disconnected? Because it's too painful to be ourselves.
So you sort of a bit like in The Matrix when Neo sees everything's made out of numbers. You look at people and you see all their trauma and damage.
That's what I see. So trauma is not the bad things that happen to you, but what happens inside you as a result of what happens to you. What do you want to tell me? What comes up right now?
Shame.
Thank you.
My father, he would spank us and take a belt to us.
Who would you speak to about your pain?
Nobody.
Yeah, that's the trauma. In other words, by the time you're 5 years old, you're completely alone. People are much more lonely and isolated than they used to be. Literally, it causes inflammation in the body and suppresses the immune system. You've been diagnosed with prostate cancer.
Correct.
In my view, people that develop cancer have a hard time expressing healthy anger.
Hillary Clinton versus Donald Trump, there were two traumatized people fighting to govern a traumatized world.
That's exactly what I'm saying. And these are the people that our society rewards with power.
Next, please.
Schools are full of kids with learning difficulties, mental health issues that are trauma-based.
Got a couple minutes left.
Sorry, I'm just I've ended that prematurely, but you'll be able to see that at your leisure afterwards. But I think you get the main point. The resilience film was screened. I'm looking to do the same with the wisdom of trauma going on. So I'm going to just show you the Relate framework that Kent has put in place to help organisations, and you can see there's prompt questions with every one of these. So the first one is realise. Next. Then we've got empower. Then we've got link up. Next is be aware. Then we've got transform. And then we've got embed safety. So the next slide in practice is encouraging people to look at these tools, looking at the service users point, looking at secondary trauma and developing a trauma-informed approach. Next, please. So we are with you as an organisation who actually put this in. They took on the language changes. They had an ACE champion. They helped all staff understand this, and they're taking it actively forward. So if you want to know more, they are an organisation who could be contacted. Next, please. The new normal 2020, just very quickly, the next slide, coronavirus. It's actually a syndemic, but as you can see by this slide, the fourth wave is the wave, and we've had the fourth wave, PTSD, economic injury and burnout, and that's what we're facing. Next. There are unquestionable links between trauma, grief, mental health and COVID-19, as you can see. Next. We know the protective factors and the risk factors that are determinants of good mental health. We know the protective factors. We know what we're at risk of. Next. We also know before COVID what we were facing in terms of escalation in mental health difficulties, particularly in respect of young women. Next. Now we've got the traumatic impacts of COVID-19. It's happening to all of us in the workplace, at home, but it's happening to us differently. So we're all in it together, but we're all suffering differently. And it will be even worse for those who've already got pre-existing traumatic experiences. Next. So these are some of the key risks. We've talked about some of them today: unemployment, bereavement, illness, burnout amongst workers, particularly those on the front line. And domestic abuse and violence, as we know, has rocketed since COVID started, particularly in lockdown. Next. And this is the reality: 10 million people needing new or extra help for mental health in the next 3 to 5 years. So it can't be a medical model. It has to move to a social prescription, so a social model of support. And that's what trauma-informed practice is all about. Next. So it's not an end state. It's an ongoing process, becoming trauma aware, trauma sensitive, trauma responsive, and ultimately, we hope, trauma informed. Next. So it really is a public health solution for recovery, developing resilience, self-care, a real preventative approach, early identification and response, and a response. And the final slide from me really is going to be implementing. There'll be a multi-agency level 2 ACE aware and trauma informed course that I'm working with the Safeguarding Partnership to put on. There'll be an information bulletin going out bi-monthly. There's going to be a new e-learning module, an online training package by KCA aimed at 3 levels. We have an ambassador program. There's going to be strategic presentations, a masterclass to kick all this off in the new year, and an organisational toolkit to help organisations become trauma informed if they want to.